Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us here. My name is Lisa Shoshony Anderson. I'm the lead curator at Arts and Literature Laboratory, and I'm joined by 2020's two all prize winners, artists Emma Pryde and Noël Ash. I will let the artists speak a little bit more about their exhibitions, which are currently on view at Arts and Literature Laboratory. We, through October 31st, this Saturday, and after each artist talks a little bit more about their exhibition, we will have a live Q&A. So please drop any comments and questions in the comment box, and those will be answered by the artists. First up, we have artist Emma Pryde to tell us about her exhibition, Night Births in the Laboratory.
So, Night Births in the Laboratory. This name gives off the idea that there has been an experiment or series of experiments that have produced something unexpected. Something has been engineered in an unnatural setting, and that thing has mutated or taken on a life of its own. It's the idea that no matter how much control humans have over life and science, there will always be unforeseen, uncontrollable consequences, especially when it comes to birth or the giving of new life. Male institutions have historically tried to control reproduction due to the fear of the feminine. My position is that creation itself is a feminine force, and creation is ultimately an irrational, uncontrollable force that has been suppressed. This force exists as a dormant entity in a backward society that worships all the wrong things. Thus, the figure in my installation exists as in a sleeping space between life and death. When I posted this image online, someone said, it's like a romantic Frankenstein. That's when I made the connection to a Shulamith Firestone quote. Romanticism is a cultural tool of male power to keep women from knowing their conditions. I use the visual language of romanticism, hearts, pinks, purples, blues, to simulate something that is overly sweet or sentimental, to the point of giving the viewer the feeling that they are in a counterfeit scenario, an artificial environment. I try to carry across the message that many things that are perceived as reality are actually fake, fabricated, false. Representations presented by the media and consensus history are ultimately untrue and meant to make us conform. The room itself is designed to give the feeling of being in a bedroom or church, an intimate space of contemplation, a space between life and death, a place of dreams and sleep. The windows are covered with cellophane and plastic wrap, casting saturated shadows, giving off the illusion of stained glass. The bed is made using a metal frame I found on the curb. The bedposts are composed of 2 garden trellises covered with fabric dipped in resin. On the head of the bedpost, there is a mask. This mask represents the outer watcher, almost threatening, a figure who watches from above. The mirror that hangs on the beaded chain is the inner watcher, the one who judges from within. So these are 2 symbols of outer and inner judgment. The bed is decorated with cast resin apples. In art history, apples can represent love, death, sin, the fall of man, temptation, knowledge, or immortality. This symbol contains the multitude of meanings and is a perfect example of how everything also contains its opposite. Around the bed are many small cast porcelain characters. There are bunnies, angels, lambs, eggs, and children. These were made from plaster molds that I scavenged from defunct Midwestern factories. These figures are infantilized representations of characters from Christian and pagan mythology. They are artifacts of an American hobby business of cast porcelain that was huge in the Midwest throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Many housewives participated in this industry, painting their own porcelain characters in group settings. In the late 80s, the industry completely crashed and almost all the porcelain factories went out of business. The reason for this was that 80% of women were in the workforce in the 1990s versus the 20% of women who were in the workforce in 1968. Women no longer had time to do this hobby. The reason I find these molds interesting is the way Christian and pagan mythological characters are changed, Americanized, and turned into crying babies, and so on. I use these characters to represent the way American culture has taken the ideologies of childhood and innocence to their extreme end. By rewriting history in a way where America is always free of blame and guilt, the oppressors have produced a culture of perversion, repression, and shame. The figure on the bed is made using a blow-up doll used for bachelor parties, which I covered in plaster gauze, resin fabric, stripper heels, various stones, and iridescent powders. This character is a self-portrait of the way I feel, caught between two worlds or two lives. She is at once a figure in a landscape of different terrain, morphing into crystals and being eaten by rats. Originally, she had 3 resin faces, but it became too figurative, and I needed to commit a violence to her identity, so I turned her face into a cellophane abstraction. This is the feeling I have of disillusion of physical reality and disassociation with my personal identity. Under the bed are 7 plastic bottles with fake rats floating inside colored water. These are the 7 chakras of the figure lying on the bed. The character is connected to an IV, so she is having her blood drawn or is on life support. This installation is a space of limbo between the outer world of institutions, media representations, and false memories versus the inner world of color, fluidity, nature, and creation. It is a surrealist autobiographical image of myself.
Thank you so much, Emma, for sharing about your exhibition. And as a reminder, we'll have a live Q&A following the next presentation by Noël Ash about her exhibition, Things Pile Up.
When I first began the work that became this thesis exhibition, I was surrounded by images of a wailing child. Oh, well, that didn't go. There we go. So I was finishing up a project about a period of aquaphobia that my youngest child went through in the year previous to beginning this work. This was a time of real loneliness for me, sitting on the edge of the bathtub, waiting for the bout of wailing to subside, for that little body to give in, isolated from the rest of the house. So I was thinking about the repetitive nature of a mother's daily tasks, about the landscape of motherhood, about isolation. When I made this first image, I was captivated by the narrative that only I could read here, of making breakfast and lunch and all the day's snacks at the same cutting board with sippy cups and last night's cocktail glasses sharing the crowded counter. I loved that stubby end of the romaine head, the carrot shavings, the grain of the cutting board, but I didn't consider this for public use. This was a painting I made for myself. I didn't make another one of these countertop still lifes for several months because I just didn't view the subject as being one with weight. I just felt like these complacent little dishes, they didn't represent any big, like, universal truth. There wasn't any real pain here. It was just this ordinary drudgery that I felt was very private. So making these still lifes in the beginning was just something I was doing for myself in the in-betweens between other more serious work. So the color palette in the beginning, because I wasn't taking these very seriously, I was a little more free maybe to play with them. It was almost random. I would key in on one color that had to exist. So it might be the butter and the cutting board. The clementine in the corner was essential that it be known to be a clementine. The melting coffee off of the rim of a soaping cup in the sink. That olive oil glass, that deep green, the pale pink of a fried egg. So then the rest of the painting's color would just kind of morph itself to fit what I had decided was the one element that I couldn't live without. At some point, these paintings, which I had thought of as still lifes and landscapes at the same time, sorted themselves into 3 different categories. I was making images of food preparation, of dirty dishes, and of clean dishes. Suddenly, my work in the kitchen was able to become a part of my work in the studio. I thought of myself as building sculptures as I dirtied and cleaned my kitchen. Cooking, I was always on the lookout for an accidental sculpture. Cleaning, I was deliberately building them. So this is what the dishes look like when I do them. And this is what they look like when my husband does them. I will clear the counter and put things away and then do like 2 or 3 successions of dishes so nothing piles up. He will do all of them at once and create these like catastrophic potentials of disaster. And so he became an element of the work that I was making as well, because I always felt like, oh, I have to capture that. I can't believe it's standing. So he was joining me in my sculpture making. And sometimes his sculptures verged on the ridiculous. In this one, you can see that the sieve at the top is passing the bottom of the cupboard that's above the counter. At the point that I made this piece, I was starting to think about the childhood landscapes, at least my childhood landscapes of the spaghetti Western. These greens and blues and sepias became the emotional backdrop for my paintings. This is sort of what I was thinking about in the back of my mind. For me, this landscape is this vast, unconquerable, lonely place. And if I were suddenly dropped in the middle of it, it would be very daunting and a bit overwhelming. And I feel that way sometimes about a kitchen after dinner. How can I possibly overcome this mess alone? Maybe that's when the drips started to come in. These were an organic element that developed in the paintings, but they felt really correct. I'm sorry about all the noise in the background. I have sent my children away, but my dog is still here and he's found something. Sorry about that. So these drips, they're not literally tears obscuring the vision, but it felt like they were part dishwater, part tears, part just the inability to see through the layers of what was being built up. So I was making these while the news of the novel coronavirus was just beginning to take over our lives. And I didn't know at that time, of course, how relevant this landscape was about to be. When I learned that the studio lofts were being closed, I only cared about the ways that my work would suffer. I didn't know that the landscape of the kitchen would become almost everything. But being stuck in the kitchen is a nearly universal truth now. This painting sculptures into landscapes can start to feel, when I look at these pieces now, a bit claustrophobic. I painted this last monumental piece in a frenzy over 48 hours before we were kicked out of the lofts. It's 9.5 feet wide, and the only piece that combines all 3 elements that I've been working on, the preparation of food, the soaking of dirty dishes, and clean dishes. And all 3 are present in this one. It's the last thing I made before quarantine became the way of life. And in a way, it is my life. The dirty made beautiful, the chaos stilled. That's where we are.
Thank you so much for sharing, Noelle. And for anyone just joining us, I will remind everybody that we are currently live with the 2 winners of the All Prize for 2020, Emma Pryde and Noël Ash. And if you have any questions for them, please type them into the comment field and I will relay them to the artists. I guess for a first question, this would really be for both of you. It strikes me, obviously, walking through the space, both shows are currently up at Art Literature Laboratory until October 31st. that, you use such different materials. Noel, you use oil paints, which kind of elevate these dish landscapes, kitchen landscapes, into kind of what is more traditionally, at least in art history, thought of as fine art. And Emma, you talked about using things like resin and found objects in your installation-based practice. Would both of you speak a little bit more about the materials that you use in your work? Emma, if you want to start off.
Yeah. Well, when I was conceiving this installation, I was mostly working with porcelain, and the installation was mostly fixated on these characters. But after we got locked out of the studios, I just started incorporating a lot of different other elements into my work. I really don't have a practice that revolves around one material. I work in a really intuitive way that's just combining whatever seems like it'll fit the vision of the show.
Noel, do you have any thoughts to share about your choice of materials for this exhibition?
I think that's really interesting because a really interesting question because of the way that I initially approached this work, thinking of it as being, not necessarily worthy of bringing into my art practice. That it was something that resonated with me, but I wouldn't know how to address. Surely it would only resonate with other people like me, and so I thought of it as kind of a lower subject, which is part of why I painted it in oil paints on panel, and I had to make that one huge piece because I felt like, no, I need to elevate this subject. And to contrast that with Emma's work, which is about when you talk about romanticism, that's how ancient that subject is, and how already incredibly like in stone and like elevated it is, and to have come at it from these various plastics and all these materials that are not traditionally steeped in fine art. Now they're found in fine art a lot, but there's not the deep tradition of it. And I love that complete upending of those two approaches.
Thank you.
Yeah, and you make a really good point that I think, both of your works are so disparate at the exhibitions, but there is sort of a common thread that both of you talked about in your presentations, this kind of, whether through aesthetics or subject matter or both, real focus on things that have been sort of traditionally coded as more feminine. Emma, you mentioned things about childbirth and a maternal instinct, as well as cottage industries of housewives creating these figurines. And Noel, you've talked a lot about motherhood, as well as things like the dishes. Domestic work is often associated with a more feminine, traditionally coded as feminine. So would both of you mind speaking to that and kind of elaborating a little bit on how maybe this could have been what engendered these exhibition concepts, or if it's maybe more of a inherent thing that you don't necessarily examine, or how does that play into how you kind of both started to create these bodies of work? Emma, if you want to start off.
Yeah, I think I gravitate to an image world that is very coded as feminine. I look at a lot of I gravitate towards feminine colors, and I guess I've tried to use my work as a place to deconstruct these interests that I've had since I was a young child. So why do I like things that look this way? Why did I have an obsession with miniatures? Why do I gravitate towards things that are cute? Do I identify with this image world? Do I feel like an infant? I kind of try to deconstruct the languages that have shaped who I am. And in deconstructing those languages, I'm sort of able to heal certain things from my life.
Noël, do you have any thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, I think I'm always in my work thinking about asserting a voice of motherhood that I felt for a long time like that was something I needed to hide, that my femininity was something to hide, and you know, because it's not strong. And then when I became a mother, I thought I dare not paint my children, because that classifies me as a hobbyist, that I'm painting in my free time while I'm staying at home with the kids. And I really had to, I'll say, be very brave to not succumb to those pressures inside me. And it felt very uncomfortable to present work in a serious setting that dealt with children. And I think I'm always trying to do that. And this work is for me about children, because if there wasn't somebody putting the kids to bed upstairs, I wouldn't be all alone doing the dishes, and it wouldn't feel so overwhelming and lonely. But dishes aren't only for people with kids, so it's not exclusively mine.
I think too, the ways that your work interfaces with, again, that kind of domestic labor and almost enshrining that, elevating that. You touched a little bit on the scale of that one piece, but if viewers here haven't been into the gallery, it really is huge. Just a stunning object landscape of a dirty sink full of dishes and a crowded countertop, something that, like you said, most people here see every day. And I think you've really done a great job of, you know, questioning why those kinds of things maybe aren't elevated, and you know, rising that up, the mundane, making it quite beautiful and really visually stunning. But for Emma, I wondered as well, you know, you spoke a little bit about this, but when you walk into the gallery with your work, it's almost church-like setting, a holy setting. It's got these sort of stained glass effect windows. It's got an icon on the wall done in sort of like I don't know how you feel about the idea of having an internet aesthetic, but that's sort of what came to mind in some ways when I looked at that icon on the wall. And you talked about in your presentation this idea of adapting Christian and pagan mythologies. Can you expand a little bit more on how religion and iconography in general plays a role in your work?
Yeah, I've always been drawn to religion. When I was young, I was interested in many different religions and ways that cultures would build a cosmology of things that were important to the society, to explain different parts of life, to explain life, death, suffering. And my feeling is that our culture doesn't adequately explain these things. And there's no way that our culture is set up in America that adequately justifies the way that our life operates. And my work is really trying to express this spiritual death, I guess, of contemporary life.
Yeah, almost that replication of the holy and the ritualized with things that are commercialized and kind of the consumer culture that we've built up. And I think your work really does a great job of that. Noël, I have a question for you, sort of based around your artist statement, which as everyone saw in the presentation, as well as you can see in the exhibition, it almost took the form of a concrete poem. Can you speak a little bit about if you have a poetry practice and how that kind of interfaces with your oil painting?
I my poetry practice is much younger than my painting practice, so I've never called it that before. But yes, I do write as well, and I was able to take advantage. Being at UW-Madison has an extremely has a wonderful poetry MFA program, and I was able to take advantage of taking courses with the poetry professors there. And so I've been working in poetry as well, and I wanted to incorporate some in this final thesis exhibition. And in the end, the poem became the statement. I didn't feel like I needed to nail it down any more specifically than that. And I did write an academic version, but I don't consider that to be anything more than academic. And yeah, it is a concrete poem. And it's, I think of it as a stack of dishes that goes up to the ceiling. That was just really important for me that I include just the ruminating on these objects that I was doing during that time. And that was why I felt like that was important to include.
Yes, and something that you mentioned is that, I think everyone who is viewing this might be aware, but both of these exhibitions, both Noël and Emma's exhibitions, were made as their MFA exhibitions, which is such a labor of love. And I know it's really difficult to kind of get through that final push. The world is really in a crazy place right now due to COVID. And I know that many artists have had difficulties with their practice in terms of having a more limited studio availability. And I guess on the more theoretical side of things, can each of you talk a little bit about how your practice of making has evolved or changed since graduating, since obtaining your MFAs, and in this COVID landscape? Emma, if you have any thoughts to start out.
Well, at first, during the first few months of when we were when the studios just locked down, it was almost like a death because we couldn't finish any of, well, if we didn't have the studio access, we couldn't finish any of our work. And I had all of this partially finished work and I wasn't able to finish any of it. So I kind of had to reevaluate my whole practice. I was lucky enough to get a studio at Art Lit Lab in July, and that has really just been the most amazing lifesaver for me. But now my practice is also changing. I'm just starting to use different materials where I don't need a ceramic studio, or I really don't need anything except for whatever I can find and whatever I can work with. So
I also had at first and then sort of an experience. In the beginning, I think it felt like we have to get through this for now. And so it was just take, a couple weeks at a time, a week at a time, maybe. And so for a little while in the beginning, I thought, oh, I can continue. I'm so lucky. These are kind of small paintings. I can fit them on my plein air easel. I can paint like from life in the kitchen. And it just is not the case with everybody home all day long. I didn't make a single oil painting after moving back home, but I thought, okay, well, I can do watercolor. And I made 2. I just everything became so much more difficult. But in the beginning, I decided to take just this different look at it. I thought, okay, part of what I've been getting into in the last year or 2 is performance. I thought, okay, this is life as art. This is a performance. I am performing motherhood, and I had kind of gotten into that mentality in the way that like everything I'm doing in the kitchen is becoming a sculpture that becomes a painting. And so I had already kind of brought the studio into the house. And so I was very, I was much more active in the first couple months after we had to quarantine, with trying to capture things with my phone. And then I discovered that dichotomy of splitting my brain between my family and my practice, because even though they were supposed to be the same, it still was like this focus of like having the camera set up and having something being produced. Like I felt like something had to be produced. And so the transition that I kind of made in the late spring was that part of this motherhood as art has to be that I'm not getting done what I hoped I would get done. And sometimes, and somehow I have to view the doing of the being there with my kids as something that I'm going to discover how it's art that feeds me later. Like right now, just being here, I'm trying to expect less and, dream smaller and just have a smaller life. And in a way, thinking of that as art is really helpful, but it doesn't look a lot like art to me in my head yet.
Well, I think that's a great attitude to have, and kind of making the most of a moment. Emma, I was hoping you could expound a little bit on the tension in your work between, these kind of cotton candy colors and cute figurines, and then that sense of almost dread foreboding the figure on the hospital bed hooked up to an IV. How does that, because you say, your work is about sort of commercialization, marketing of the feminine, but those, first of all, the aesthetics, I would say, especially the figurines you touched on that were the cotton candy colored porcelain figurines, are certainly not the aesthetics of consumerism today, as well as I think some of the color scheme is a little bit more oriented towards perhaps like a late 90s kind of a style. And so how does that, almost the consumerism of yesteryear with these friendly colors, friendly appearance, I feel like you're kind of working the breaking point and the tension point between that and the more theatrical narrative elements of the installation, where someone could be sort of struck with a bit of an eerie or reverent atmosphere. Could you speak a little bit more about that tension and kind of how those aesthetics feed into today's market of consumerism?
It was muted. So it's deconstructing my childhood, which was in the 90s. And I think a lot of these cutesy characters were still around in a lot of ways. And I see them at thrift stores now, but I think in the Midwest, they were still around a lot in the 90s. And I think a lot about the way our childhood was presented to us as millennials is so different from the way that we're experiencing it now. We played with doll houses. We played in these plastic houses outside. We would play house, yet we'll never own a house. We have no future. The world is just in shambles. And so it's like this dichotomy of what we were, this overprotected, like cutified world that we were presented when we were young versus our actual reality. And we're supposed to contend with the two things. And it's just this feeling I get of utter dismay, a feeling that everything is just illusory.
Yeah. I mean, I can obviously sympathize with many of those points. And I think that, Noël, in your work, you talked a little bit about this mounting pile of dishes is almost like this feeling of dread that's coming to overwhelm. And I think that, while your paintings are very beautiful, I think that they have, conveyed that through maybe the color scheme, and everything's kind of almost monochromatic or very muted. Did you have any sense of what the viewer would be feeling as they walk through the exhibition, if you wanted them to feel sort of oppressed by these dishes, or if they should kind of see them as works of art and appreciate them? I think you're muted, Noël.
Yep, sorry about that. I don't think that, I don't think that unless, I think that unless the viewer brings their own feeling of oppression to the pieces, there's something uncanny about the color scheme. There's something maybe, there's something a little bit like the lights aren't quite on about the color scheme. Sometimes I feel like they look like you came into the kitchen the next morning and haven't turned the lights on yet. But I don't think they are oppressive. Even the giant one, I don't think it feels like it's gonna fall on you. And I don't think that was my goal, but I do think that that dishes can feel that way, but I don't think the paintings do that. I think they accumulate, and that with an accumulation of them, it's, doing the dishes once. I remember when I was young, living in my parents' house, and that like huge amount of dishes on Thanksgiving or Christmas, and everybody pitches in, and it's actually kind of joyful. I think it's the repetitive nature that becomes oppressive. And so part of me wanted to just completely fill the space with dozens of them. But I think that's a future exhibition. I wanted them to each have their own space, like a jewel this time.
Yeah, and I mean, you touched on the repetitive nature of dishes, and I think that's echoed in your painting. I don't know if you ever had a daily practice of painting these dishes and your sink, but it kind of almost comes off that way, like again and again, and repetitions on a theme, obviously. So did you ever do that for a more meditative quality for yourself, to kind of document this changing landscape in your own home, or was it more of a over time sort of practice?
That is something that I'm hoping to do once schools open up again. Yeah, that was my plan, was that at this time, I would be making a mess in the kitchen all morning and then painting it all afternoon. And that's, not, we're not living in the world we thought we'd be living in. But I still think that could be in the cards, yeah, in the future. I don't see myself leaving this subject matter just yet.
Well, that's good to know. I just have two more questions, one for each of the artists, and they both kind of relate to how this work may have changed while creating. I know that both of you mentioned that you were kind of locked out of your studios before the complete fruition of the bodies of work on exhibit at Arts and Literature Laboratory right now. But more specifically, Emma, I'll start with you. The imagery of a figure sort of shrouded on a hospital bed, hooked up to an IV, I think has particular resonance right now. And, you even touched on the idea of the exhibition being a meditation or a depiction of the sleeping space between life and death. And now that, the specter of death, not to be morbid, but is sort of more in our faces every day as we kind of navigate this pandemic. Did the pandemic itself coming up right before you installed this, did that impact the final product? Or do you think that it just sort of takes on a new light during this time? You're muted, I think.
I've actually done this same situation in many different forms. So it's this single figure on this bed in the middle of a room. I did it in 2016 with this performance. And I just realized after I made this installation that it was basically the same installation, but very different, much more complex. And so this is sort of like a recurring theme in my work, is this character, this sleeping character. But it definitely takes on new meaning during this time, I guess, in different ways. Yeah. But death has always been a theme in my work too.
I think that, you know, the imagery of medical practices as something that we're all sort of more used to seeing on the daily within different forms of visual culture, be that a newspaper or the internet. So I think that when viewers do see the, again, shrouded figure hooked up to an IV bag, it is a little eerie in that it's so pertinent and relevant to this moment. So I think that the work really, really resounds right now. And my last question will be for you, Noël, and it's sort of along the same theme, which is, I know you mentioned again that you created this final large colossal painting right before you were kicked out of the studio. And now, as you again mentioned, you know, my daily landscape certainly looks a lot like a big pile of dirty dishes. You know, how do you think the viewing experience of this work has been impacted by everyone's world just growing a little bit smaller right now, whether you're isolated or not, just kind of depending more and more on the domestic interior, and how that might affect how people view the work, how people interact with the work, and what feelings that might spark in the viewer.
Showing the work in this particular circumstance feels like at least I can feel good on one hand that, like, I feel like, well, this is a much more universal experience right now. And I can be glad about that, like, I think people can come to it. But I think it always has been something everybody deals with, but it's much, I think other people are coming to it with the same feelings that I had, more of the feelings that I had. And so that feels good, seems wrong to say, but appropriate. And I just feel like it's the work has become more relevant just because of the passage of 6 months.
Absolutely. Actually, we do have a few questions from viewers before we wrap up for the evening. If anyone has any additional questions, make sure to put them in the comment box. Noël, here's a question from a viewer in the UK. Noël, my question would be, do you think the time has come to develop your artwork with a European tour? So I think there's an international audience here for you. Do you have any feelings on that?
Thank you. Thank you. I am 100% interested in that.
For anybody listening out there. And Emma, could you elaborate on how the role or lack thereof of spirituality in the modern US influences your work?
I think I can only speak from my own experience, but for me, it's just a feeling of total groundlessness. I can't find reasons for the way things are set up structurally in our culture. I think our culture worships the wrong things. I think people care about power. They care about the things that are the complete opposite of what life should mean and the way that we should be able to live and care about each other. That's my position.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that again, that's really well reflected in your work. That's of personal experience, kind of informing the tensions there. Well, I think that that is about it. Thank you so much to both artists, Noël Ash and Emma Pryde, for joining us. Big thanks to Jim Cruel for doing our technology here. And you can see both Things Pile Up and Night Births in the Laboratory at Arts and Literature Laboratory on Livingston Street. We have limited gallery hours right now, which are available on our website, artlitlab.org. Thank you everyone for watching. And again, big thanks to both artists.
Thank you so much for hosting this.